Hi, Brian Dunbar here from Grex Airbrush. We're going to demonstrate how to fully disassemble the Tritium Airbrush. So let's get right into it. Let's discuss the tools that you'll need for this full disassembly. We have here the wrench that comes with the airbrush in the box, a crescent wrench, a jeweler's fine standard head screwdriver, a Phillips head screwdriver, and then a larger standard head screwdriver. Let's start with the items that we would normally remove from the airbrush during a typical cleaning process. The crown and nozzle, the handle. Let's go ahead and take the color cup and cover off, cap off. On the back side we have the knurl that holds the needle in place. Rather than just unloosening it, let's remove it completely. Slide the needle out. On the front end we have the nozzle cap. And then of course we have the fluid nozzle, and that's where the wrench that comes in the box comes into play. Simply put it on, gently push counterclockwise, and that should loosen it. Remove it by hand. Now we get into more complicated areas. Let's talk about removal of the handle. We have a nut in which the adjustable wrench is used. Turn counterclockwise. It'll unthread easily again by hand. And now the handle just slides right off. We now have the air valve assembly. This needs to come off next. There'll be an explanation as to why later on. When your airbrush comes in the box, you will need to use the wrench once again. Simply apply it to the flats and gently push counterclockwise. Once you've done that once, you can remove and hand tighten without any problems. When you remove the valve, you want to make sure to be mindful of this little cuff at the top. It could remain inside the airbrush, or it could come out with the valve, but you want to be mindful of that so it does not get lost. We have the back portion of the airbrush. Simply unthread this. It is spring-loaded, so when it unthreads, it comes off accordingly. You have the spring and then the chuck. Now let's remove the trigger. That's where the jeweler's flathead screwdriver comes into play. Simply remove the pin. There we go. And the trigger just slides right off. Now we have the slider inside. And what we need to address first is this small screw on the underside of the airbrush. The reason why we remove the air valve assembly is you need to be able to come straight in with the Phillips head screwdriver. If you come in on an angle, you run a very good chance of stripping that screw, and the only way to have that fixed is to return the airbrush to us, and we do not want you to have to do that. So you want to come straight in and simply remove the screw, and there it is. Now we have this brass bushing inside, and with the screw removed, it simply comes out by using the large screwdriver and simply unthreading it. Now there's another spring inside the airbrush that will simply drop free. Lastly, the slider will come right out. Oops. So there you have it. That's full disassembly of the Tritium airbrush. We're going to demonstrate how to reassemble the Tritium airbrush. So let's go ahead and start with the body itself. First we want to go ahead and address the slider assembly. We want to make sure that the square-sided portion goes in first. We then want to put the large spring in behind it. And then we have this bushing, which has two threaded holes that we need to be aware of. As we thread this back into the airbrush body, there's a port on the underside of the airbrush in which we will thread the small screw. And we want to make sure that the threads of the bushing interface with that port appropriately. This is just a standard flathead screwdriver. And I can see the threads. There we go. Let's go ahead and put the small screw in. There we go. This is when you want to use your Phillips screwdriver, and you want to just gently tighten it. Just nice tension. You don't want to over torque this or damage the screw head. Next, we can put the valve assembly in. We want to start by working with this little silver cuff. There's a chamfer on one end and it's flat on the top. You want to put the chamfer down on the air valve assembly and then simply slide that into the airbrush body, and you can simply tighten this down by hand. You do not need a wrench for it to be properly sealed and to function properly. Next, I like to put the handle itself back on. And with that, we have our nut. This again can be tightened down simply by hand. If you wish to use an adjustable wrench, you may do so, but generally speaking, it's not necessary. Hand tight usually keeps it nice and secure. Let's go ahead and address the trigger. We simply slide that into place, and with the pin that secures it, we use a jeweler's flathead screwdriver to tighten that down. And now the slider and the trigger are functional. Next, we want to continue at the back side of the airbrush. We have our chuck. Let's go ahead and slide that in along with the spring for the second stage of the trigger. And then we want to use the back housing of the airbrush. Simply thread that down and you'll feel tension from the spring. That's normal. And then we can put the knob on, which will eventually tighten the needle. On the front end, we want to go ahead and put the fluid nozzle in. Start it by hand. Once it snugs up, utilize the wrench that comes with the airbrush in the box and just a gentle tension on it, and it's secure. No more than that, otherwise you may compromise the threads. Next, we want to put the nozzle cap on, and then we can go ahead and put either the standard nozzle or the crown on, because next we're going to put the needle in the airbrush and we don't want to compromise it by bumping it. Let's go ahead and slide the needle in. Gently push until it comes to a stop. Lock it in place with the knurl. Next, we have the handle. Thread that on. Put the corresponding nozzle or crown on the back end. And then lastly, we have the color cup and the cap. We have now successfully reconstructed or reassembled the Tritium airbrush, so it is 100% and ready to go.